Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome, new person. Thanks, returning listener. How is your week? I hope it was better than mine. Not gonna lie, been having a rough time. And it's not really even me. On some level, my own internal world has been well. I feel like the teacher training's been going well, and I'm doing good study, and inside myself, I'm feeling okay. It's just dealing with an overwhelming feeling of heaviness and sadness because so many people around me, people I care about a lot, are not doing well, are struggling in a very deep way. It feels like for the last 2 years, we've all been putting on our most courageous faces. And now that for a lot of us, the masks are coming off, the trauma of it all is now starting to be felt. And those of us in the yoga world who've been doing trauma-sensitive yoga trainings and whatever, we've learned something about trauma, haven't we? About how it lives in us and how it manifests in us as time goes on. Well, it just seems to me that there's a lot of trauma that is only now first starting to really be recognized and felt. And I'm just not going to sugarcoat it. It feels that there's going to be some grim days. I hope that if you're listening to this and you're feeling down bad, that you have some people around you, somebody that you can talk to, and hopefully some resources. I mean, at some point, I really feel I don't know that there's anything I can do in these situations outside of seek help. And, you know, like I said, I feel like I've been doing some really good work in a lot of ways. And I hope that these conversations that I'm recording and sharing are like in some way helpful. They're helpful to me. I'm hoping they're helpful to others. I guess I just want to send my love and a spirit of fortitude and strength and nurturing love and compassion that I can for everybody. And, you know, speaking of internal landscapes and deep inquiries, I have a really wonderful talk to share with you today with Alejandro Chaoul. And I mentioned something about it at the beginning of the talk, but that it was one of you, it was a listener of the show who told me that I should look into Alejandro, and I think that the intuition there was right. It led to a very rewarding conversation that continues a lot of what's been going on the show here for the last few weeks. I've been really delving into different philosophical viewpoints, and it's amazing to me how those philosophical viewpoints are not limited to particular traditions or lineages, that there's viewpoints or ways of looking at things that seem to intersect with all of the traditions. So Alejandro is somebody who teaches and is learned in specifically Tibetan yoga. And to hear him speak about what he's learned and how the philosophical viewpoints apply within that frame really, for me, offered even further clarity and even a little bit of like a real nice conclusion to it in some way. You'll see. I really felt like we got to some wonderful places, and it was a real joy to meet Alejandro. And I'm really very honored to share it with you today. Real quick, before we get to that, I do want to express some gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. Today, I want to say special thanks to Amelia Baisley and Petr Bondarev. Thanks a lot, Amelia and Petr. We really appreciate you supporting the show. If you're new around here and you want to have access to the full archives, or you want to help support this show, the way that you would do that is become a podcast premium subscriber. It's choose your rate, cancel at any time. And if you don't have any money right now, all you have to do is email us and we will give you a free account, no questions asked. But if you have even a little something to give, it certainly makes a big difference, and we're immensely grateful to anyone who's doing that. To learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or find out about any of the other stuff I'm doing, I've got weekly live classes that I give. I have weekly discussions that I do. I also have on-demand videos. All of the stuff that I'm doing can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right, y'all. I think I'm just going to leave it there. And I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's do it. Let's go ahead and get into this conversation that I had with Alejandro Chaoul. Hello.
Hello.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Same here. So, I always like to meet the people I'm talking to.
Yes.
So it's nice to see, even if it's virtual. And where are you?
I am in Pennsylvania, in a place called Easton, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour and 45 minutes away from New York City.
Okay.
And I moved here in 2017. I lived in the New York metro area for 20 years. I had a yoga center there for 10 years.
Oh, okay, great.
Before I moved here, and the world fell apart and everything.
Yeah. And what's your first name, if I may ask?
My first name is Jason, but all my friends have always called me Jay, and there's always been another Jason Brown wherever I lived my entire life. Including another Jason Brown who taught yoga in Manhattan when I first moved there. So I started going by J and putting it as J period because I thought it was very literary. I fancied myself a writer. So
great.
It's stuck over time.
Sounds good.
Well, where are you? You're in Texas, is that right?
I'm in Houston. I'm in Houston, Texas. Yeah. I'm originally, as you maybe know, I'm originally from Argentina. And I moved, first I was actually closer to Virginia. I've been in Boston, in Virginia, in Charlottesville, and now here. So different times of my life, kind of part of my transfer to undergrad in Boston, then my master's in Virginia. And I moved here for my PhD and got stuck in the swamp here. So,
well, I have some family in Charlottesville, and so I know some of the areas that you speak of, and there's some other wonderful synchronicities and coincidences that have brought us together. And, you know, it's interesting because I should give them a shout out. The main reason that we're talking is because a listener of this show, whose name I believe is Holly. I don't know if I know Holly, but Holly emailed me. She's been listening, and I've been picking on all these different threads and kind of asking people about different things. And she emailed me and said, I think you should talk to Alejandro, and I said, and I looked into it, what she was talking about, and I listened to those podcasts on Guru Viking, which are awesome. He's great, by the way. I really like that guy. I love what he's doing. I'm happy to point people to that stuff because it was great. And as I listened to them and learned a little bit more about you, I thought, oh, there's all kinds of reasons why I would love to talk with Alejandro. But listener Holly's intuition was correct.
Perfect. And Charlottesville is very close to Charlottesville, not only is where I did my master's, but it's where we have our main retreat center for Ligmincha International. So I don't know if you know Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, but it's actually more it's Shipman, Virginia, but it's really 40 minutes from Charlottesville, and also close to, now that you mentioned synchronicity, to Brother Charles' place, as well as to Yogaville. So there's some centers there that are...
Maybe there's some geographic juju to that place that's making everybody create retreat centers there, right?
I'm sure there's something. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about that was a synchronicity for me is I also was born into a Jewish household of sorts. It was a very modern Western, I guess what you would call conservative Jewish, not as opposed to Reform or Orthodox. Right. I grew up in Los Angeles in the 80s. And so I was a bar mitzvah. And I remember a specific moment more around 16 where I happened to read the translations of all these prayers that I knew by heart, that I had learned. And I remember declaring to my father, I don't believe any of this, Dad. And I told him I wasn't going to go to temple anymore. And he said, oh, well, I don't believe it either, but your mom does, so you're going. And to me, that was actually a good reason. Like, as long as I didn't have to believe it was for her, I was more okay with going. But it was definitely a moment. And I heard you talk about that. I heard you talk about the moment that you first said you were a Buddhist. Right. And I guess my curiosity about that is, in a way, to me, it is a big leap in the sense that there's some really fundamental differences about how you see the world from like an Eastern paradigm or worldview religion as opposed to a Western worldview religion. And to me, pursuing yoga or was about not having organized religion. And in a way, I've often heard, I had someone on just recently talk about Buddhism as sort of a non-religion religion for lots of different reasons. And I'm just curious what you might say to that in terms of what that fundamental difference is, because there is a big leap you have to make in a sense.
Let's see, something happened. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, for some reason it went straight into the AirPods. I didn't do anything, but so yeah, no, I mean, do you want me to start I mean, like, I don't know, are we already on?
Yes, I like to consider us having begun. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
I like to just get started and get talking and get to know people, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine. I as you were mentioning, I was also born in a Jewish family back in Argentina, and my family were also conservative. And for those people who don't know so much about Judaism, conservative doesn't mean Orthodox.
No, it's actually not that.
It's actually quite liberal, but it's not as liberal as Reforms. It's actually. So, people went to Reform and then they realized, oh, we don't want it to be that Reform. So we moved to, that's what they call conservative. So, and a lot of times, and I don't know if this happens in the States, but at least in Argentina, some people, and I think my family's at least was in that, the idea of cultural Jewish, which means that, again, if I would ask my father or my mother, like, do you believe in God? It wasn't much of a topic, but we're Jewish because culturally. And I think, of course, that was exponentially an identity after the Holocaust, of course, which, my father had to escape, and he was born in Europe. My mother was daughter of those who escaped from Europe. And so, And so I think that strengthened identity-wise, right? But as you said, one thing I was, I don't know if escaping, but for me, it was, I didn't really find the answers I wanted, neither in Judaism nor in any of the ways of Christianity that I was related to. Argentina is a very Catholic country, and I was in a Scottish school, which was Presbyterian. I mean, I went really to learn English, not necessarily to be Presbyterian, but there was some of that, and none. I couldn't find none of the answers I was looking for, and so it was more of that at the beginning than the kind of organized religion part, and parts that have been interesting. For example, you may remember this too, that in the synagogue, many times when we mention the name of God, Adonai, we bow, right? There's a sense
like a
of
davening, like the rocking that they sometimes do, right?
And although the rocking I always kind of liked, I think the somatic part of that I liked. I was really, I don't know if rebel or I didn't like the bowing down. I was like, what am I bowing to? And I didn't get the slap on the neck, but I did get kind of the look of that. Interesting enough, years later, as I became Buddhist, and one of the times my father saw me doing prostrations, and he pointed out, he said,
same thing.
Wait, you weren't ready to just bow your head, and here you're throwing yourself into an idol, right? Because from that perception, so it was interesting. However, I think what happens, or at least I'll talk from my side, is I think we're all in spiritual journeys. I feel that it's a spiritual journey with some labels here and there, but it's a learning experience, and so I found that in Buddhism, I learned a lot about things that I didn't realize in Judaism, but that they are there. They're clearly there. So I think there's a lot to learn, and I love that phrase by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. A good heart is the best religion, because at the end, and heart, I guess, in a Buddhist way, both wisdom and compassion, both sides, right? So yes, and as you were mentioning, that time where I realized that, I'm actually Buddhist, it was really interesting because it was in the early 90s. I was part of a group that was bringing His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Argentina, and we were from different religions. I had already done my first trip to India, where I stayed a long time, and I went from kind of looking for a teacher, from Hindu teachers to Buddhist teachers, and that's when I really went into Tibetan Buddhism. And so I was here in Argentina. We were actually in the back at that time. We were in the back part of the main church, of the main cathedral in Buenos Aires. We actually had an archbishop, and he was this big guy and a strong voice, Monsignor Quarracino. I remember him very well. And we were part of this interfaith committee. We were organizing, amongst the things that we were organizing for the visit of His Holiness was an interfaith meeting at the cathedral. And so we were in the back, and I was, 25 years old. And so I was sitting there. I was kind of the kid. And actually, that's how, the Monsignor Quarracino looks at me and he says, "Kid, and are you a Buddhist?" And I look at him. And until that time, I was always saying, I'm Jewish practicing Buddhism. But that moment was revelatory. For some reason, I looked up and I said, yes, I am Buddhist. And so I always say that it was, almost like with the blessing of Monsignor Quaracino, I became Buddhist, right? It was my some in many of the Christian traditions, they have, baptism and confirmation. We have bar mitzvah, so I guess this was my confirmation. And since then, even though, the Dalai Lama would say you don't need to convert. So it wasn't because of a need. It was really a sense of embracing this identity. Again, not to do with the Buddhist church, if you would, but really that, yes, this was the way I practiced. This was the way I oriented myself spiritually. And so from there, I was always really continued. I still continue today to work interfaith. I really think that's really important. But as one of, again, another Catholic, actually, priest in Argentina, Padre Brown, he would say, in order to really do interfaith, you need to have a position. It's not about merging and doing a stew, right? So that's how I feel. That's how I feel.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know in the yoga world, there's often been not some debate around sort of like a Christian yoga, like, can you have a Christian yoga? And, there's lots of interesting scholarship out there to support the idea that you could, that there's always been yoga across all religions, and that it makes perfect sense in some context that there would be a Christian yoga. And that makes sense to me. I think people utilize these practices often to enhance whatever faiths they may have. And I'm all for that. I'm all for people feeling better and being more compassionate human beings, whatever the path may be. I guess what my curiosity, though, is that there is sort of, as I've evaluated my own impulses or motivations like you, to really go out of what the culture I was born into and to embrace practices and traditions from a culture that I do not come from. And there's something very fundamental, as I was saying before, about, and it's interesting, maybe I can ask you this question, because when I was listening to those podcasts, you kept referring to a practice that you were taught. And I think I heard the word right, but I might not have heard the word right. I think it was an English word, but it could have been a Tibetan word, and I was hearing it wrong. But you referred to it having a long form and a short form, and you were, I think, calling it my non-dual practice. Is that correct? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I wasn't hearing it. I thought you were talking about having a non-dual practice.
Sure. I mean, maybe Dzogchen. Mm-hmm. So yeah. So within, so it's interesting. So, within the yogic tradition, and again, yoga is, today it's used as such a broad word, right? It's almost like, well, yes, if you go back to its origins of yuk, of uniting, when two things are united, it's yoga. Well, I don't know if we could say that, but it seems to be, it's almost like mindfulness today. There's mindfulness, everything that you could do. And yes, but is that really when we refer to the term, right? So again, and I might be, when depends on how I talk, I could be very open and broad, and I could also be very anal in the academic part as I've learned it, right? Mm-hmm. And so
you've got the scholar and the practitioner side. I was listening, yes.
Right. And so, yes, of course, mindfulness could be everything, but that's not how it's referred in the text, right? Or yoga can be everything, but it's not how it refers to the text. And yet there's something about, the way that we refer to these Asian mind-body practices that yoga has part of. Yes, it's a practice that it's contemplative and it includes the body, and that the link usually between that body and mind is the breath. So if we think of practices that include mind, breath, and body, whether you call them, traditionally in Sanskrit, asana, pranayama, and samadhi, then, well, that is yoga. Although today, as we know, there's a lot of this postural yoga, just asana is what we refer to the yoga. Now, in the yogas, although I did learn some of the Indian yogas, my focus is on the Tibetan yogas. And the Tibetan yogas, it's interesting because there's less of a focus on asana per se, and there's more of a focus in movement. And this movement, many times it's called trulkhor, which means a magical movement. And the reason of being magical, it's not kind of magic in the way that we many times think in the West, but it's magical because it brings experiences that are kind of coming from inside. In fact, there's a metaphor that I think for many it's hard to understand because I don't know, but in any case, I'll mention it. It's a Tibetan metaphor that it says if you squeeze a snake, legs come out. And what it means, besides, if you want to look at it observational and, is that when we, through the body movements and so forth, when we squeeze ourselves into these postures, we allow these experiences to manifest. And so that is really the way that we talk about this this magic part of the movement. And what's interesting also in these movements is that you're holding the breath throughout the movement. So in a way, it's a different system, even though we are now calling it Tibetan yoga. In a way, it's also a translation that many of us chose, which is not really a translation because the word in Tibetan is salon trulkhor, so it would be magical movements of
channels and winds. That's what you wrote. Channels and winds. I like channels and winds.
Yeah, channels and winds. Yeah, Tsa is channels. Lung is wind. Sometimes in one of the Sanskrit words could be prana, and so Tsa could be nadi, So you could think of, nadi prana yoga.
So wait a second, you kind of jumped ahead for me because I watched some video of you doing these practices and I've got lots of questions about them. It was wonderful. The resources that you've put out are really great. And I have had a conversation about some of this stuff before. I had a guy named Ian Baker on some years ago.
Oh, I know Ian very well.
So we had some conversation, but we talked about red rose paths and white rose paths. I was on like a different trip back then. But I think for me, I guess before we get into those physical practices and the movement and stuff that you're doing in there and holding breath, I didn't know you were holding your breath throughout them. But in any case, we can talk about that. What I'm first interested in is where they situate, because what I'm getting at, why I was kind of asking you about non-dual before, is that it seems to me a lot of times physical practices can be presented in lots of different ways, or teachings can even be presented in different ways. I've had Patanjali taught to me in a way that was totally dualistic, where the goal is to escape the cycle of rebirth. And I've had Patanjali taught to me in a way that had a tantric lens to it, where it wasn't at all about that. It was much more about integrating into my life. So I'm always kind of curious about where these teachings situate from, even the physical practices. And I guess you mentioned, or I heard you talk about meeting UG Krishnamurti. And I met UG Krishnamurti. I spent a few hours with him. He had a big impact on me. I've heard you talk about him too. And I guess maybe, I know you've spoken about it before, but maybe for people listening now, you'll talk about the time that you met him and how you met him and what your experiences was. And then I want to compare notes.
Sure. So this was almost, so when I went to India in 89, 90, that I went originally just for a couple of months and I stayed 9 months, I almost feel it was a gestation period for me. in the early part, so it was still in '89. I went to this event just after the Dalai Lama was named. What was I don't know what's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he had just come back to India, and there was an event to receive him, and I was able to be there in Delhi. And I was sitting I was by myself, and I was sitting next to this Indian person who started talking to me, and very friendly. And he said, if you're interested in something like this, you need to come with me. I have a teacher that I think will be wonderful for you. I said, sure. I have nothing to do after this. So we went to UG's house. And so it was in Delhi. I don't know if it was his house, but where he was staying in Delhi. And I got to meet him, and he would give these talks and then just be there. And it was a relatively small group of people. My memory is maybe around 15 people. And I remember that the first talk he gave, it was almost like this, destroying all my philosophical, I had been, one of my majors of my career, in undergrad was philosophy. And he basically destroyed everything, kind of all that you have in your mind, it's useless, kind of come down. And interesting enough, although I'm using the word destroying, it was actually liberating. It was very liberating, and I loved it. And then I said, now what? And he said, just be. And I was like, what is that? How do I be? And he wouldn't say anything else back to me. So I was like, I spent 3 days there, and I couldn't get more than that. It was, I enjoyed his presence. I enjoyed the small group, but there wasn't even, okay, meditate in this way. It was just sit and be. And so as I didn't know how to be, I left, but I still cherish him. I mean, I think it was a, beautiful few days that were very impactful, and I never met him again. Never saw him again.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience. I only spent a few hours with him in a hotel room in Midtown Manhattan. And I think it was like 2003 or 2004 or something. And it was quite an experience too. I found he was very kind of mean. He was very aggressive with people in the room. I think it was because of the people who were in the room and the questions they were asking him. He was really this. I remember I walked in and he was basically screaming at people and be like, why are you here? I have nothing to say to you. And I got really uncomfortable. I was like, oh my God, what's happening? And then other people were just laughing and saying, UG, but I hung around, and it was what you were saying. He was just tearing it all down, all the, putting people up on pedestals. He was like, those holy whores, they're selling you a pack of lies. He was cursing, the most foul-mouthed, yogi sage I ever met. And I was like, wow. And I remember someone asking him about Patanjali, and he said, Patanjali was just an academic. He never did any of the things that he wrote about. And he's just saying all this stuff. And my takeaway was really similar to yours in that it was very empowering, because it made me feel he's basically saying you don't need to do all this stuff, that it's going to come from within you, that you're already as you are, or something like that. And I remember specifically the kind of communication was, if you get what I'm teaching you, you'll never come back and see me again. And I took that to heart. I felt like I understood what he was teaching, and I had opportunities to see him again, and I never went back to see him again, because I was like, nope, I understood what you were teaching. I'm not going back to see you again,
That's interesting. I was just thinking, is he alive?
No, he has passed a few years back, I think.
I think that if, in 2003, I would have been close to New York and I knew that he was there, I would have probably gone. maybe because I didn't get what he had told me. But you know, I mean, as I said, I mean, he was quite impactful. And I actually, you know, when I was in India at that time, I met many teachers. But he was one that was very impactful. The other one, of course, was Swami Chinmayananda. He was very, very impactful. I almost decided to stay in his ashram. But then when I met the Dalai Lama, you know, and I don't know if I shared this in public, so I was with, you know, in one of the ashrams with Chimayananda ji. And I thought, I mean, I loved being there. It was great. But at one point I had already been with the Dalai Lama, and I was really wanting to go back. I mean, even though I enjoyed being in the ashram, and at one point I'm with Swamiji, and he's sitting on a table eating, and I'm sitting on the floor, and he's giving me prasad, right? And I say, Swamiji, I love this being here, but I think I'm going to go with the Tibetans, and he's known as the Dalai Lama. And he looks at me and gives me some more prasad, and he says, "You're not going, you're not coming, everything is Maya. Go, my son." And it was such a blessing. It was such a blessing. And actually I met him one more time after that. And so I felt really touched by the way he taught. He was very funny, and also had a very interesting story of, you know, even though being born Indian and, you know, then studied in England, came back to debunk the myth of the swamis, of, you know, of the gurus. And after a while became a guru himself.
I mean, I guess that might lead into another question I have in terms of like the difference between like a monastic path or like a householder path. And I know that Ian talked about red robe paths and white robe paths or whatnot. And I guess I'm curious about that. Do you consider yourself a renunciate, or do you live a householder's life? And are the teachings different depending on the path that you're choosing?
So I'm married. I have kids. So I'm not a renunciate. One of my teachers, if you see the tanka in the back, the teacher down there, he's 97 years old now. He's Lopun Tenzin Namda, fabulous, great teacher. My last book I dedicated to him, but I've been with him since '91. And he's just, you know, remarkable. Actually, as I say here, you know, when I'm in difficulties, I hear his words telling me, "Don't forget we're in samsara." And as I visualize him with his wonderful smile, those difficulties and obstacles seem to dissolve like a snowflake in the ocean. And when that is not enough, I practice these magical movements. So you know, there's something on that path. And he's a monk, so he was trained and always stayed in as a monk. And at one point he said, you know, "Would you become a monk?" And I knew I was not going to be a good monk. So and you know, interesting, I guess, going back to Judaism again, you know, the role of the rabbi, and I'm not trying to compare myself to a rabbi, but you know, there's something there about understanding the community. So, you know, from what I understand, rabbis get married, have kids, so they can be good counselors, advise the community, because the majority do get married and have kids. So there's some of that. I don't think that was my main reasoning. I think I was already odd enough to have become a Buddhist, that if I would become a monk, I guess, I don't know what my family would have said. But in any case, I was also already engaged, and so it would have been very complicated. But it's 26 years later, and we're still married, and we have two kids. And so I always continued this path. Now, he's one of his main students, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who was also a monk during his old training. At one point, he disrobed. So I guess if we're going to use Ian's words, kind of from the red path to the white path. Mm-hmm. And I think the way he uses that is because the majority of the monks use this red robe, and the majority of the yogis, or nakpas as we call them in the Tibetan tradition, nakpa meaning more like tantric, right? Ngak, like this mantra. And so is usually they wear white and red. So, and usually it's long hair. I mean, and my first teacher, Nakpa Yeshe Dorje, was married. So I wore long hair for 30 years. And I always kept it in a ponytail. And the only reason I've changed that now is because a year ago, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. And during her treatment, when she lost her hair, I decided to shave it too. And I felt that even though my teacher, Nakpa Yeshe Dorje, has passed away, that I would think that he would be okay with that. He actually himself passed away of cancer. So I continue in that tradition, but my teacher, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who now is married and has a kid and, continues to teach in that role. And so I have both teachers that are monks, still monks, some that are being trained by monks, and that are yogis. And I also know I have some teachers that are yogis and were always yogis, like Nakpa Yeshe Dorje, like Lama Chemsar. So I've been blessed to have numerous teachers of both traditions. But and I know in other traditions, right, of Buddhism, like in some of the Zen traditions, you could still be called a monk and be married. But in the Tibetan tradition, usually a monk means you're celibate.
Yes, and I guess my questioning about that has to do with, I don't know, just trying to find some clarity around, there does seem in some traditions, maybe not in the one that you're coming from, where the idea that a renunciate is able to get to a higher level because of their renunciation of all these worldly desires, and you can understand that just from like a practical standpoint, like when you don't have all this other stuff to deal with, you don't have to pay a mortgage or whatever, and you can have an alms bowl or whatever it is, and you can just meditate all day and just, delve deep into the inner realms. I can understand why, yes, but I've often had a bit of an aversion to the idea that it becomes like an elitist thing or this hierarchy thing.
Right. So, yeah, and that's true. By the way, our audience doesn't see us, but the light in your room.
The lights come through the window. It's blinding out the camera some.
And the rainbows that I see behind you are beautiful.
See, I'm turning into a rainbow body. We can talk about that later. No, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think you're right in terms of the, there's some conception that if you follow the renunciate path, I don't know that. I mean, I guess some people would say higher, but some people would say more like what you have more opportunities to do that because that's what you're doing all day. Although there's plenty of them that get stuck there, right? I think from our tradition, it doesn't, either way you can become enlightened and either way you can stay in samsara. So, that's just the path. It doesn't mean that you accomplished the result. And going back to the kind of non-duality part, in in terms of path, from the Tibetan tradition, we talk about three paths, right? What we call Sutra, Tantra, and Dzogchen, right? And so the Sutric path, I mean, and it has to do with how you deal with the obstacles, right? With the poison.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.